which is a bit frustrating because one of the things which was a bit of a surprise to us Right, here we are again. So it's been a little while. I seem to say that a lot at the moment. But the last time we did an episode on this car was literally like, I think the week before the lockdown in the UK. So as our team has been very reduced during that time, we haven't made a huge amount of progress, but we have made some, and we're now basically at the very, very end of the metalwork process on the car. So probably a good time just to show you the kind of final bits that were involved with that before probably next week. This will go over into our blasting room. We'll blast it, zinc spray the underside, epoxy the whole shell, and then it'll be over to Gaz, our body shop guy, to start prepping it for paint, which is certainly the thing we're all looking forward to most. Where we were last time, we were obviously just finishing off the interior. And I talked about the fact that the engine was going to have to go back in for the final time, predominantly to finish off this area where the airbox goes through the inner wing for our cold air intake. And also, while we had the engine back in for that, we wanted to plan out all of our plumbing and wiring in the engine bay and make provision for all of that. So we did that. We got the engine back in with the carbon airbox, which we got from Reverie, and so we were able to finalise this area here, basically just get it all exactly how we want it, made sure we could actually get the airbox off over the trumpets, and then we've made a little stainless steel bezel that sits on here, which will basically hold a rubber gasket that'll seal that airbox to the inner wing to stop kind of water and dirt ingress into the engine bay, but will also allow the engine movement without anything chafing. So we got that done, that'll look good, and then we started planning out wiring and plumbing, so various holes and things you can see. Things like these are for engine management wiring, will come through over there. This one here is for basically a stud that goes through for the battery cable, so the battery cable runs through the car from the boot to the inside of that stud, which is insulated from the metal of the bulkhead. And on this side there'll be a cable going down to the starter motor, which then splits off to the alternator as well. These holes, the smaller ones, are generally for where we're going to put riv nut threaded inserts afterwards, after it's painted, which will retain various things. So this line across here will be where the brake pipe runs from the master cylinder over to the near side of the car. There'll also be on the same fixings the clutch line, which comes out from that side, runs down and into the clutch slave cylinder on the gearbox down there. There's some welded bosses, there's one there, one over there. That one over there is for the brake T-piece. So the brake line will come out of the master cylinder. This is the front line down to that T-piece that's mounted on that boss. That's where it splits between the line coming to this side and the other line going through the inner wing. And we've put holes again here as be where bulkhead fittings on the brake lines go through, and that's where the flex seal attach on the other side to go to the actual wheel caliper. So all sorts of little provisions like that. And then also a more major thing was the radiator mounts. This was the inner wing kind of area was completely clean. Originally the radiator mounts into some pegs at the bottom there, with some little tabs at the top. We wanted to kind of introduce some side mounts on it to completely block off the airflow around the radiator, so any air coming through the grille is forced through the radiator, and just to give us a slightly more substantial mounting for it. Now what we've done is what we do on quite a lot of our builds now is we just fabricate a steel dummy radiator basically that kind of outlines the actual outer profile, the thickness and the various mountings that are going to be on it, and this is what we'll provide to our aluminium fabrication guy to then make the final radiator based on this pattern. So that basically slots down in between those mounts and bolts straight into threaded inserts that we've welded into the mounts there. These are for the fan mount, and then, actually no, I tell a lie, The fan mounts actually onto tabs off the radiator frame up here, which we haven't included because the fabricator who's building the radiator can make a judgment on where they are because we'll give them the fan. These are for the air conditioning condenser. So we've gone the sort of biggest condenser, the standard size, standard off-the-shelf condenser we can actually fit in there. And then this is for the air conditioning dryer unit, which sits just at the side here. And then there's basically a hard line, aluminium hard line that comes out of the condenser here, down to the dryer, and then the other side of the dryer and the bottom outlet from the condenser then join together, loop round and come out under the back of here, which is actually what this oval slot down here will be. So the two hard lines will come through here and just sit with a threaded fitting here and here, which will then connect the next section of line 2, which will run around here, around there, and come up to 2 of these holes in the bulkhead here. The other 2 are the heater water pipe connections. So that is now ready to be sent off to have the radiator made. So that's that. I mean, a lot of the other work we've been doing is just finessing of the body. So we had all the doors on, getting all the doors to be, the fits to be perfect, doing all the lead loading. So this joined along the scuttle, which you can see that side as well. These are original joins where in the factory they had a fairly crude join in the panel and then they just fill it with lead and file it to the right shape. So we're just recreating that original design. The frames on these cars, they have like a separate chrome frame that slots into the door and actually bolts in. And they were amazingly hand built, these cars. So there's huge variations from one set of frames to the next. And actually, because we had this car and a parts donor car, we went through all the frames for both cars to select the best fitting set and then kind of tweak them to get the fit absolutely spot on. So we've had every panel on, bonnet on, boot on, all the door frames, everything latched with the seals in place, and then done all of our lead loading and body filing, so everything kind of sits right with the right size gaps. And that's really kind of the tail end of the metalwork process. We've done a few more bits of work in the boot, which I'll just pop down there and show you now. Right, so I don't think we've really shown much of the inside of the boot before. And actually there was some old modifications on this shell when we actually did some previous work on this shell, and then it was set aside for a long period of time. And that included refabricating the boot floor. So the actual complete boot floor isn't standard. We put some exhaust tunnel modifications in it previously to give room for some silencers at the back here. So that's already fairly non-standard. You can also see where we extended back the boot floor for the Watts linkage for the rear axle. So that whole section there is basically housing the Watts linkage that goes onto the diff cover. This here we've done more recently, so that's the bracketry for the fuel tank. So the fuel tank will basically sit onto those flat plinths there. There'll be a slight wedge shape which goes right up against the bulkhead, and then there'll be tank straps that attach down there over the top of the tank, down into this hole here, and then the cutout here is so you can get a spanner in basically to do the nuts up on those. Battery will go in the side here. So we've done the clamps for that. That's all ready to mount the battery once it's painted. And then the boot latch, that was the thing we were working on last, which is actually, interestingly off a Nissan Sunny. We were looking at the original Jaguar one, which is only a very simple latch, but there was not a very obvious place to mount a remote actuator onto it, and we want an electric release. There's normally a button on the back here, so it has to have some kind of hidden release. So our plan is we've got an electric actuator in there, and then there'll be a cable as an emergency release as well, in case the power fails. But there wasn't a very obvious way to adapt the Jaguar, and then my brother had a sort of moment where he thought, oh, what's quite a simple boot latch that's a similar shape? Oh, I think Nissan Sunny is something like that, as you do. So we bought a new old stock Nissan Sunny, I don't know exactly what model it was, boot latch, which is absolutely perfect. Mounts almost in the same place. It's very simple latch plate that it locks into, and it just gives us a nice place to actually get the actuator in. So this rod here is basically just in here at the moment simulating the motion, but we'll have an electric motor down on here that'll pull that. And then there's going to be a cover plate which actually runs all the way across here to sort of box in that rear section, just to give it a kind of cleaner appearance, but also allow us to hide that motor. So that'll be the electric release, so you'll be able to do that off from a button in the car or off the remote. And that's about it. I think the rest of this we've shown you all. We've done a fit, I think we've done some more lead work, so all of this kind of silvery looking area here, and the same over here as well. We've done some lead filling and body filing, same at these original factory joints at the top and around the filler that side. So in terms of the actual body at the back, we're about done. We've got some holes to put in here for number plate lights, and then further down the line we're going to be, once we've done the body work and it's painted, we're going to have these rear areas 3D scanned to then build a CAD model of a bezel that will go around this rear light, which will then have chrome. So there'll basically be a chromed bezel sitting around this rear light just to make it look a little more correct, if you like, but a bit more classic. And there's quite a bit of sort of CAD modelling we're doing for this, and actually most of the builds that we're doing these days seem to involve quite a lot of modern technology, whether it's 3D scanning, 3D printing, you know, CAD modelling. There's quite a lot of that involved. So I might just pop next door and show you a couple of those things now. Right, so I will hasten to add here that I'm not the person who does the CAD here, but there are 3 guys who are all fairly CAD proficient, so a lot of stuff is done that way these days. So this is Fusion 360, it's what we do all of our 3D drawing in. You might remember from a previous episode that we had a bit of a game trying to combat the bump steer that was kind of inherent with the steering rack conversion, and that involved quite a lot of basically trial and erroring different rack positions until we were happy with the geometry to get basically the right Ackerman angle and reduce the bump steer to an acceptable level. And we basically did that by just cobbling up some steel mounts and moving with big slots in them and moving everything and trying it, moving it and trying it until we were happy with everything, and then spacing these as well. And once we were completely happy, Stu just tacked these up reasonably solidly so they couldn't move, and then we've measured these and drawn up the final mount, which, I mean, that's the mount on the screen there that we're going to, for one of them anyway. And then the beauty of the 3D printing equipment we've got is that in the past we'd have drawn that and then had that machined, but if we'd have made a mistake with it, we'd have had to have had another one machined and obviously written off the cost of the first one. With the 3D print, we can basically 3D print that, try it on the car, and check that there's no errors before we then get it machined in aluminium. And obviously the cost of doing the 3D print is a lot less than the cost of doing it in aluminium. So that's that. I mean, there's a few things we've done on CAD on this car, not as many as on some of them. The steering arms, that was another thing that was involved with the sorting out the steering geometry properly. So we've done revised steering arms, and then done a rough 3D print, which we actually used while we were doing the final mock-ups of the rack, and they will now be sent away again to be machined. What else was there? And the other thing was, which we've now finished, I think we touched on before because we did a 3D print one for the mock-up, but we've done our own inlet manifold, which we've now completely finalised the design on. Added a few little more details on there. There's these little bosses now on the intake runners, which may be for the vacuum takeoff for the servo. What we've done is we've put one on the end because we're not sure until we run it whether taking off from one port will give us a smooth kind of uninterrupted vacuum. We've had this on some cars where if you do it from one port you can actually feel the pulses of that cylinder when you've got your foot on the brake. Now, isn't always the case. We've successfully done it off one port before as well, so what we decided to do was we'd do the port on the end open and drilled for that servo feed, which will probably be fine. If it's not, we've done these little bosses on the rest, so we can drill all of those and do a link pipe running across there to link basically the vacuum off all cylinders to do the servo vacuum. But we've left those undrilled, so they'll just be flat bosses there if we don't use them. So So that's that. And on the subject, I guess, of engine related things, we've also started the engine rebuild. So I'll just nip through to our engine build room and show you. Okay, so this is our engine build room. I don't know if we've shown this before. If you've been watching this project from the start, obviously you'll know we're putting a Toyota 2JZ engine, naturally aspirated, in this car, and the reasons for that were explained fairly early on in the series, so I won't go on about that now. Now, with all our projects, we're basically trying to turn out a new car at the end of it. It's obviously not technically a new car, but we want everything to be in a condition that you could describe as new. And that means the engines are rebuilt, and we go kind of through every single component and basically take them back to bare castings. So that's if we're not using a new crate engine. And usually we do that in-house. So at the moment, on this one, we are doing it in-house. So we've stripped this down, that 2JZ down, that's the head over there. You see the valve gear over there, cams, rods and cranker over there, and that's the block on the floor down there. Now our normal process is, once we strip that block down to a bare block, and that means taking out everything like the core plugs, or freeze plugs as some people call them, all the oil gallery plugs, so there are no dead end oil or waterways in there. We then get them acid stripped to basically clean the whole casting back to nice clean metal. We'd then send that away to our engine machinist down the road, who would bore it to suit whatever pistons we're going to use, and just skim the block face so it's nice fresh finish on the mating face for the head. Then we'd get it back. Usually at that point we'd mask all of the machine surfaces that have any sealing faces on them and paint the outside of the block. We normally do that actually sprayed in our paint booth. And then we'll get it back on the stand in here and actually start doing the build up with all the components. So we'd start with the block, getting the crank and rods in there, and everything that's involved with that. Now normally I would go through and we'd show all the detail of that, but actually in this instance we discovered that Toyota have still got stock of complete short engines, which means that basically the block fully assembled with the crank, rods, bearings, pistons, and all the other fasteners and parts and seals that are part of the block. So we've just gone down the route of getting one of those because it's quite reasonably priced anyway. So we're not going to show that. I can't, unfortunately, still get a new head from Toyota, which is a bit frustrating because one of the things which was a bit of a surprise to us, and it's probably one of the first real negatives of the project, is that on this cylinder something has evidently been dropped into the cylinder at some point. Only something quite small, but it's caused some damage to the head face here. It caused matching damage, of course, to the piston, and because the piston had been damaged at the side here, that had also scored the block, and that's one of the reasons we definitely needed to go with boring it. And in some instances, on engines that have very minimal wear, you can actually, it's not necessary to rebore them. This was pretty good wear-wise, but it did have that damage to that cylinder, so we would have had to have bored it to different size pistons, and that's when we went down the avenue of, well, should we check if Toyota actually still do a complete block, and they did, so that's the route we've gone down. But we have got to get a new head. So I'm going to have to try and get hold of a better used head, which I'm in the process of doing now. I probably will have sorted that by the time this episode goes out, but if I've not, if anybody's got naturally aspirated, so 2JZ GE cylinder head in kind of good condition, that would be great. Because this one, although the damage wasn't enough to actually show any running issues with the engine, but we obviously can't leave it like that, so it's going to have to be sorted. Worst case scenario, we would be able to repair it, but it's going to be most cost effective just to get a better head casting and refurbish that. So what we'd normally do once the head's down to this stage is we'd get that vapor blasted to clean it all up to nice shiny alloy, get the actual mating face skimmed, and then set about rebuilding it. I mean, in this case we're going to use the standard valves. We'll just chemically clean all those valves so they're back to nice clean metal. So that's it. We're just sort of in the early stages. As soon as we get that block from Toyota, which we'll be getting next week, we've also got a whole host of parts coming from there. So all of the things like water pump, oil pump, all of that type of thing we're getting from there. The oil pump is going to be the turbo oil pump, which is slightly higher capacity and also has the mounting for a crank sensor. On this one, it still had a distributor, which also contained the pickup that told the ECU its crank position data. Now on the turbo ones and the later ones, they had a crank sensor onto a toothed trigger wheel and did away with the distributor, which is what we want to do. We're going to run an aftermarket management system, but we want to have a crank trigger actually off a toothed wheel. So what we're going to do is use the turbo oil pump and the turbo crank pulley that has the tooth wheeled on it and the turbo crank sensor, which will then feed our ECU and give it its crank position data. So yeah, that's where we're at basically. Sourcing a new head, then probably next time we do a video we'll be filming actually the build of the engine, which this is going to be famous last words and tempting fate, but it should be relatively straightforward.
With the lockdown and all that business, how much did that set
us back?
Yeah.
With this project, more or less the time that we were not working, so certainly 2 months. Nat and I were carrying on with specifically 2 projects. Nat finished the Cortina metalwork and then moved on to the Morris, and I was doing the Mercedes W111. But yeah, the Jag basically stopped as of lockdown until Stu came back, which was a few weeks ago now, 6 weeks ago I think it was. So we've had kind of 6 weeks of one guy on it, but we were still behind by a couple of months because that was about how long the guys, all of the team, were off for. So yeah, we're behind a bit, but nice just that, you know, all things considered, we're not in a terrible situation compared to some people. So, you know, we're still getting to build lots of cool cars. I think the only thing, but it's probably a bit late to mention it, but I was thinking of saying near the beginning that obviously there's not going to be a lot of... People always criticise us already for not having much footage of the work actually being done, and obviously in this episode there's 0 footage of the work actually being done. So that's something that's relevant. But hopefully that's going to change reasonably significantly with introducing our own little video blog videos. Hopefully people will get to see a lot more detail on stuff actually being done.